in terms of through agroecology, trying to recalibrate or reconstitute local food systems is very much this idea of experimentation. I think in this existential challenge of the Anthropocene has meant that any normative solutions to questions of climate change, to nature-human interactions, I think are completely misguided. And we, I think, acknowledge through this conference how COVID-19 has revealed itself as possibly one of the first comprehensive crises of this new era. So the idea is that in South Africa, there's a sense now of, yes, there's a second surge. Perhaps it's also beginning to affect Namibia, a little bit in Botswana. But in fact, will we ever really come out of these surges as it entwines with different things? And the argument is that despite the warnings that we had about this, it has taken us by surprise. And by general, one could argue that governments have been found wanting, and yet this climate crisis that is behind it is still looming. I think it's very clear that in terms of the food sovereignty campaign in South Africa with their recent charter, I mean, their argument is that the IPCC estimates that we've got 10 years to ward off some of the most disruptive climate impacts in southeastern Africa. And this means that we've got to have a complete fundamental shift in terms of how we work. So the whole idea that policy can somehow provide a framework, engage in a normative way, enable people to do things and solve problems is misguided. But we need this continuous reflection that there is no silver bullet, and there's certainly no silver policy bullet. So that's the first provocation, the idea of, as we're thinking about recalibration, how do we experiment in ways that are really in a terrain that requires working with the unknown. The second is working at different scales. So localization, of course, is incredibly important. So you can imagine a place where you are trying to reconstitute or recalibrate a system from growers and producers of food right through to different eaters and consumers. Now that's incredibly important, but without broader systemic change, surely that system itself is going to be incredibly vulnerable to these big pressures that we've talked about. So the whole idea then is to work at different scales, is, for example, thinking about policy around farmer support and extension that holds agroecology at its core. But then simultaneously, how are we doing training with farmers, but also with support agents, with extension officers, so that they themselves, when they work with, for example, a PGS group, can be working at a localized system. And all three of those things operating at different scales, then converging to enable change. And this was an attempt, an experiment that we tried to facilitate in South Africa, working with extension policy, with a very well-meaning team within the Department of Agriculture that were beginning to be sensitive to agroecology. There was a willingness to engage. There was a group of extension officers that wanted training at 17 Shaft in Soweto. A training facility was set up. The earlier graduates of that group had gone off and were beginning to establish. But that experiment ultimately failed because 17 Shaft as a learning facility couldn't sustain itself. There was all kinds of questions around how it was accredited. There were questions around where its funding was found. The extension officers themselves also didn't get funding from their own directorate within government. And so ultimately, although this scaled experiment was put in place, we couldn't finance it. And that was very, very important to recognize. But there was a success in Zambia, where with HIVOS facilitating a process, again, thinking about healthy diets based on agroecological principles, they recognized that agricultural policy was absolutely key, but that it was based on mainstream, conventional, heavy inputs. It's about food security, maize security, that you could engage at that level. But in fact, the real change needed to happen at a very local level. And so the Lusaka Food Policy Council was set up with the Kasisi Agricultural Training Institute providing support to many of those officials in that policy council. So again, working at the scale of national policy, working at a city, but then getting a local group that were deeply committed and embedded, spiritually embedded within agroecological principles to work then with those. And again, that's an experiment that's unfolding. So the point being, we've got to not only work locally, but we've got to work at these different scales to try and reinforce and enable things to emerge. I was reminded that we've also got to work across scales, that somehow we've got to bring those extension officers with the policymaker, with the trainers, into the same domain as well, so that there's learning. And that, I think, is also important. So it's not only working at different scales, but cross scales. So that's the second provocation. The first, experimentation. The second, working nimbly with different scales. The third domain or provocation is about principles and about guiding principles that are embedded in agroecology. And here, what is interesting is that it creates a tenant or something that we can base ourselves on in terms of how much pushback there is in the system against these new localized systems that are based on agroecology. So here, if we are taking on, for example, the deconcentration of the food system in Zimbabwe or in South Africa, there is the assault of all of these Trojan horses in terms of the language of sustainable agriculture, or the language of climate smart agriculture, or even the language of the Anthropocene. And a Trojan horse has within it essentially the elements of the old in order to sustain and seed them in new and different ways, ultimately to destroy because you're entering. And so the principles mean that you are true to the words, that you are questioning weasel words that are trying to dilute or perhaps make others believe something that isn't true without directly confronting it. And so here in eThekwini, in Greater Durban, we've tried to enable local-based systems to begin to emerge, but the sets of principles around agroecology force us to test all the time whether we are in fact compromising or limiting ourselves with some of the work that we're doing. So that's the third, the issue of principle. Experimentation, working at scales, and then commitment to principles. Something we're all very familiar with in a system is to understand the different actors. And this has also been very interesting and important in terms of working in terms of a practical way at a particular place. If we think about a flow of food of a particular area from a particular set of farms connecting with a few markets, who are those actors? Who's missing from there? What are those flows of food? And in many ways, an actor analysis can then underpin this place-based approach with local people themselves undertaking that analysis of who's there and who isn't there. And again, this work was done both in Entebbe in Uganda and in Lusaka in Zambia. We've tried to do it in South Africa, in eThekwini, and a place called Ilembe, Stanger, which is on the north coast of KwaZulu-Natal. And here the idea is to understand the different producers and the different markets, but also to consider what is often neglected in terms of the enablers of the food flow between those producers and those eaters of food. So who's aggregating all of that different produce? Who's collecting it in waste? Who's transporting it in terms of either pickup trucks or bakkies? Who are those, for example, processors? So processors of food, preparing them, for example, for community kitchens or soup kitchens or relief agents in terms of soups or such and so on. To think about markets in terms of schools, informal stores, vendors, traders, restaurants, government projects, all of these things. And doing that with local people with different methods like NetMap, which is something Luke is deeply familiar with through his PhD, we're able to then understand where there are different gaps and where there are opportunities. And one of the key issues that often emerges is, why are the consumers accepting so readily what is there? Where is their agency? Where is their enablement? Which allows questions to be asked about, what are people eating and why are they eating it? What can they afford and what is their preference? What then is the diet quality? So the actor analysis in terms of understanding the flows of food, the farmers, the people providing seedling and seeds, right through in terms of the enablers, right through to them to those that are consuming it, gives that picture to then enable what is then the next domain. Who are the enablers? Who are the people that can then connect these new flows of food to create redundancy in the system. The issue of COVID and the lockdown, particularly of the informal economy in places like Harare, Cape Town, Durban, Lusaka, was that very quickly we realized that there wasn't a lot of redundancy in the system. The flows of food were very few and very fragile. The whole argument here is that with different enablers, you would be able to introduce very quickly many more flows of food. And so the argument here is to seek those individuals who see and know the system, highly skilled, locally grounded support officers who have both a technical role, so they could be an extension officer, they could be someone working, for example, with BioWatch, a local NGO in a particular place, but they also have a facilitatory and connecting role. So they're doing more than imparting knowledge and undertaking analysis, but they are literally introducing or helping mediate a particular exchange or connecting people. In Uganda, this group was called the Coalition of the Willing, and they were run by the Kabarole Research and Resource Center. So a group of researchers working in a district, seeing that there was this particular gap, stepping into the breach, and then enabling different groups to come together. In Zambia, it was played by Pelham. So Pelham and Kasisi, two very strong organizations, then coming in and literally seeking the opportunities for then underpinning that system. So the enablers of the system being essentially the fifth domain. The sixth, and this comes from a critical review then of trying to establish those new flows of food, is who is holding power in that system. Jane Battersby from the University of Cape Town and an activist academic has argued that it is much more than just resetting these diverse foods of flow. It's much more in enabling more choice in the system. It's about who is really making decisions, who are those enablers in terms of underpinning. And this is something I think we all know very, very well. How are those actors connected? So the argument that we then undertook in Durban and Ilembe was to say, who are those with the different types of power in order to recognize them so that they could be counted. And in this, what was very clear was how the farmers were so often dependent on the extension officers or operating as individuals. And even though there may be small cooperatives and collectives, there was a general disorganization or general weakness in terms of coming together. And so the opportunity of bringing PGS into this environment in order to strengthen farmers connected to local communities, where there is a sort of the active involvement of people in the situation, that you could actually then counter perhaps the countervailing system that was pushing back. The other, to strengthen the groups of farmers, was around voluntary savings and lending groups. So here, an example that was very much pioneered in the early days by CARE International, working in Mozambique and Zimbabwe, and now rapidly being developed, being adapted in South Africa, is around essentially creating self-reliance in terms of money within those groups of farmers. So again, being able to have a level of sovereignty to be able to then push back at the bigger system. Another very interesting analysis around power is power around nature, and seeing nature, soil, farms, trees, rivers as different actors back in that actor analysis, and to understand then those actors in terms of ecological risks. So again, in parts of Harare, but also in parts of Durban, understanding intermittent flooding. So nature playing a role, having certain power, being neglected in many ways, seeing how, in terms of custodianship of a particular river, the neglect, how then that river itself can become a risk at a later stage. And so to broaden the analysis of the actors, but also to broaden the analysis of power, to think about nature as both vulnerable and with power in terms of it, and opening up opportunities around that. So those are 6 domains: experimentation, working at different scales, commitment to principles around agroecology, the actor analysis, and from that to understand who the enablers are, from that to really understand power, to the last, which is about learning and adapting. So when all of these things are coming together in these particular places, interacting at different scales, to understand that we are in these complex, messy conversations in this time of unknown. What happened in Zambia, what is happening in Uganda, what is happening in parts of South Africa, and to acknowledge when things go wrong and readily welcome that, so that there could be something done to remedy the course in terms of counteracting those mistakes. And this reality very much forces us to learn by doing, which I think is in many ways a liberating opportunity, but at the same time incredibly disconcerting for organizations, particularly for government if they're part of the role. But guided by principle, these things are very possible. One of the methods we do in terms of learning around experimentation is something called learning journeys, where groups of actors, so from that system, but from also outside of that system, perhaps with those with certain power from policy or maybe from somewhere else, coming together into a process of seeing the system, of experiencing the system, and then pulling back and reflecting back on that system is also a way of recalibrating or seeking the opportunities for recalibration. The final point about learning sort of, I think, raises something that Luke has argued a great deal, and that is also around the learning around agroecology itself, and the assumption that this is something easy, that it is something in terms of markets connected to farmers around agroecology that can just simply be done. But just how much support and real learning is required in terms of fundamental shifts in terms of the way we act and behave and are. So I try to keep it contained in terms of a conversation and a reflection. The domains of experimentation, working at different scales, commitment to principles, actor analysis, finding the enablers, understanding power, and then this willingness to learn and adapt are simply then the reflections in terms of talking through the practicalities of place, exploring approaches to the localization of food. So I'll leave it there.